Welcome back to the Fourth Trimester podcast, where we explore the postpartum experience through interdisciplinary, evidence-based perspectives. This is your host, Brianna, and today I'm taking you on the historical perspective. I'm going to walk through how transition from pregnancy to postpartum has evolved over time, how risks in recovery have changed, and how infant feeding options have developed across centuries. So let's start by looking at how early postpartum care has shifted over time, from community-based, female-led midwifery to a more medicalized, hospital-based model, and then finally landing somewhere in between. And this isn't about saying one approach is necessarily better than the other. It's really about understanding the timeline, how we got from there to here, and how that shaped the postpartum experience for mothers. So before the 19th century, birth and early postpartum took place at home. Women were supported by other women in their communities, often midwives who learned their skills from previous generations rather than formal education, as Towler and Bramall describe in their 1988 work. These midwives provided comfort, nourishment, and guidance before, during, and after delivery. And for many families, birth wasn't just a physical event, it was also a religious, spiritual, and social moment, followed by midwife support through the physical and mental changes that motherhood brings. In addition, Towler and Bramall share in their 1980 article that these midwives actually helped with other things like household chores so the mothers could focus on recovery. Then, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, things began to change a bit. Historian Rebecca Kaufman shared that male medical personnel entered the world of childbirth and postpartum recovery, arguing that midwives were unscientific, and the experience should take place at a hospital under medical supervision. This message was gradually accepted, and by about the mid-20th century, approximately 90% of births in the United States took place in hospitals with physicians, according to Brodsky in 2008. Then later in the 20th century, we saw another shift, the re-emergence of midwifery. Historian Kaufman linked this shift to the broader conversations about women's autonomy and decision-making. Some families were dissatisfied with the highly medicalized experience, sharing that mothers and babies were being separated after birth, family contact during the early postpartum hours were restricted, and unnecessary practices like pubic hair shaving were common. This dissatisfaction helped spark a return to midwifery, but this time with regulation. In 1994, legislation was passed in Ontario to formally regulate the profession, making it the first province in Canada to do so. Regulation ensured standardized education and qualifications for the midwives to provide care during and after uncomplicated births. So then where does that leave us today? While in many places, care has evolved into a collaborative model between midwives and physicians. Pregnant women have options. Someone might choose a midwife as their primary provider, but choose to deliver in a hospital setting so that if a complication like postpartum hemorrhaging occurs, physicians are immediately available. This partnership really supports the autonomy and decision-making of women in their postpartum journey. And what stands out most in this timeline is that we've come to realize that it's not about choosing one or the other. It's simply about person-centered care, ensuring mothers receive education, support, and resources to make informed decisions about what is best for them. Both physicians and midwives share the same goal: to foster a mother's confidence in her ability to care for herself and her baby, to support a smooth recovery, and to minimize unnecessary pain along the way. Now, it feels natural then to transition to another major area of postpartum history, being the changes and risks in recovery. So, physical risks like hemorrhage or infection have always been a part of birth in the postpartum period. The difference is that in earlier centuries, these complications were more likely to be fatal. Author Alice Reed from the University of Cambridge in 2020 shared that before the development of antibiotics, sterile surgical techniques, safe anesthesia, and structured prenatal and postpartum care, even routine deliveries could be easily life-threatening. Advances in medical science have significantly reduced maternal mortality in many parts of the world. In Canada, for example, the maternal mortality ratio was 117 deaths per 100,000 births in 1945. And then by 2023, that number had fallen to 12 deaths in every 100,000, according to data collected by the World Bank Group. And globally, we've also seen progress. The World Health Organization reports a 40% decline in maternal mortality between the years 2000 and 2023. Yet this progress has not been evenly distributed. In many lower-income countries, severe bleeding, infections, and unsafe abortions without access to high-quality care remain major causes of death. For example, in 2020, Nigeria reported 1,047 deaths per every 100,000 live births. So while history shows undeniable progress, these numbers also highlight global inequities that persist in access to contraception, high-quality care, and systems that really prioritize women's health. Then moving from risks to recovery, we see more advancements, but we also see another area where we're still learning. In 2017, historian Leah Asbury synthesized and analyzed primary historical sources to better understand historical postpartum recovery across Europe and North America. She found that from the Middle Ages up until about the 20th century, postpartum recovery consisted of what is called the lying-in period. Lasting about a month, postpartum women were expected to remain confined to their beds, and once they stopped bleeding and reached the end of their lying-in period, they were considered recovered or well. But Asbury's deeper analysis of the 17th century personal writings and medical texts revealed that the end of this period did not equate a full recovery. In fact, many wrote about how the women looked and felt weak and sick long after the bed rest period. Fast forward to today, and we see almost the opposite recommendation. For women without complications, early light movement is encouraged. The Public Health Agency of Canada supports light walks with your baby and pelvic floor exercises early into the postpartum period. Yet, similar to the past, there is still tension around what a full recovery means. A 2025 cross-sectional study by Fremerson and colleagues examined whether the traditional 6 to 8 week recovery period that doctors and midwives follow today actually reflects women's experiences. Through online questionnaires by women between 3 and 6 months postpartum, they found that only 42.5% experienced a full recovery across physical, mental, sexual, and functional domains. Other important findings include that the average time to a full recovery was actually 15 weeks. Daily functioning tended to return first, often within the 6 to 8 weeks, but sexual healing frequently extended beyond that point. The authors also noted that age and delivery type, whether vaginal or C-section, also influenced recovery time. Their conclusion was clear. Postpartum recovery should be individualized, and more research is needed to promote full healing in postpartum women. So even though medical science has advanced dramatically, our understanding of what recovery truly looks like is still evolving. And our last major topic of the historical perspective is infant feeding decisions. One of the first things a new mom has to figure out in postpartum is how she's going to feed her baby. And just like the models of care and the structure of recovery, feeding options have evolved over time. The most obvious and historical consistent choice is breastfeeding, that is, feeding the baby directly from the mother's breast. Beyond nutrition, breast milk also provides the baby with immune protection. But here's the thing. Not every mom can or wants to breastfeed. A primary research study by Ogbuano and colleagues looked at why women don't breastfeed and collected self-reported reasons straight from the mothers themselves. The list is pretty wide-ranging. Some women needed to go back to work. Some had other children to care for. Some were overwhelmed with household duties. Others felt embarrassed, wanted their body back, or their partner didn't want them to breastfeed. On top of that, there were physical and medical reasons, difficulties with lactation, illness, smoking, having a premature baby, or even previous breast surgeries. So between the 14th and 17th century, wet nursing was the primary alternative. In this arrangement, another lactating woman would breastfeed the child. Wet nursing actually became a regulated profession, with women signing contracts and following laws for the practice, and it remained the most popular alternative for mother-to-child breastfeeding until about the 18th and 19th centuries. Then moving forward into those 18th and 19th centuries, bottle feeding with cow's milk became more common. Earlier bottles posed hygiene concerns, and bacterial contamination contributed to the death of 1/3 of artificially fed infants. However, following the Industrial Revolution, improvements of the bottle design and sanitation significantly reduced this risk. In the same period, the first chemically formulated food alternative was marketed. The formula was made of cow's milk, wheat, malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate, and it was meant to mimic the nutrients that one would get from mother's milk. Then, in the early 20th century, a soy-based alternative formula was made for infants allergic to cow's milk, with added vitamins to support development. And today, infant formulas are regulated by Health Canada. The product must demonstrate sufficient nutritional content to support growth and development, and must be safe for consumption before it can hit the shelves. When we look at this history, one thing is clear. The fact that not every woman can breastfeed has been long acknowledged. That's why alternatives were always being developed and refined. From wet nursing to modern formula, feeding options have evolved, and today, both breast milk and regulated formula can provide sufficient nutrition. So what matters most is supporting mothers in making safe, informed decisions that align with their circumstances, values, and needs. So looking back at the history of postpartum care, we can see just how much has changed, how women were supported in the past, how risks have shifted with medical advances, how recovery has been defined and redefined, and how infant feeding options have evolved over centuries. Understanding this history reminds us that progress is based on the support of women through evidence-based, individualized guidelines and respect for their autonomy to make decisions about their bodies, their recovery, and their babies. I deeply thank you for tuning into this episode on the history of the postpartum experience. I'm so glad you're here, and we'll see you next time.